The estuary speaks in grass. That's what Doris Payne's uncle used to say, standing knee-deep in the tidal flat at low water, running his fingers through the eelgrass the way some men ran their fingers through soil to test it. He said the meadow told you everything you needed to know about what was happening below the surface, in the places where the water and the sediment and the living things were working out their arrangements. He said that if the grass was healthy, the water was honest, and if the grass was struggling, the water was keeping a secret. Doris was 69 years old. She had been reading the grass her whole working life. She had inherited the crab and oyster operation from her uncle in the spring of her 32nd year. He handed her the dock lease, the tide books, and the key to the skiff and said, "Everything I know is in those books. Read them before you do anything else." She had read them that same night, all 14 volumes going back to 1958, in her uncle's small, even hand, and understood immediately that she had inherited not just a working waterfront, but a record, a continuous account of the Piankatank estuary in Mathews County, Virginia, told one tide at a time across 3 decades. Her uncle's father had started the operation in the 1940s and kept notes, though not as systematically. Those earlier records were in a different box, looser, more story than data. But they were there, part of what Doris had been reading across the 37 years since she took over. She kept the tide books in a waterproof cabinet in the dock shed. Her own volumes filled the right side now, 37 of them, beside her uncle's 14. She wrote in one every week. Water clarity, bottom conditions, grass coverage, species present, what changed and what didn't. She had started doing it because her uncle told her to. She had kept doing it because the estuary kept changing in ways that she could only understand by comparing what she saw today against what she had seen before. The eelgrass was the most important thing she tracked. Not the crabs, not the oysters, the grass, because without the grass, there were no crabs. Without the crabs, there were no ospreys. Without the ospreys, there was no particular quality of morning on the estuary that made everything else feel like a reasonable price. The first time she noticed a thinning, she almost didn't write it down. It was the autumn of her 64th year, and she was running the skiff along the lower basin's northern edge the way she did every month, looking at the grass from above. The eelgrass meadow in the lower basin had always been dense enough to be visible from the surface on a calm day, a darkening in the shallow water, a texture that distinguished it from bare sand bottom. She knew every section of it the way she knew the layout of her own house, not by measuring it, but by crossing it in every season across 3 decades. What she saw that autumn was a softening along the northern margin, not bare bottom, not death, a loosening. The shoots were shorter than they should have been, more widely spaced, as if the meadow was considering a retreat it hadn't yet committed to. She wrote it down. She had seen grass thin before. The estuary moved through cycles, and the grass moved with it. You had to watch something across multiple years before you knew whether you were seeing a trend or a variation. That wasn't the part that troubled her. The part that troubled her came 2 months later, when she pulled out her uncle's tide books and read his entries from the autumn and winter of 1983. He had noted exactly what she was seeing now, a softening along the northern margin of the lower basin meadow. He had written, grass thinning on north edge of lower flat, shorter shoots, wider spacing, probably the winter drawdown, watch in spring, and then, the following spring, grass rebounded, north margin restored, current year normal. She read those 2 entries 4 times, and then she sat in the dock shed for a long time, thinking about what she knew and what she didn't. The county road project had been completed 3 years earlier. A small tributary feeding the upper estuary's western arm had been rerouted as part of a road-widening project, a culvert replaced, the creek's course adjusted by roughly 40 yards before rejoining its original path. Standard infrastructure work, unremarkable, forgotten within a season. Doris had logged it. Road crew working west tributary culvert. Machine work in creek bed. Turbidity visible at upper estuary mouth for 4 days. She had not thought much about it at the time. Temporary turbidity from construction was normal. The estuary recovered. It always had. But now she was reading her uncle's 1983 entry, and she was thinking about sediment. The tributary that had been rerouted was the estuary's primary source of fine sediment. the silt and clay particles that settled on the upper basin's bottom and were gradually redistributed by tidal action across the lower flat. The rerouting had not stopped the tributary. It had changed its angle of entry into the estuary, and that change had altered the pattern of sediment deposition, not dramatically, not visibly, season to season, but over 3 years. The sediment that had previously settled in certain places was now settling in others. The northern margin of the lower basin meadow received its sediment from the upper estuary's tidal distribution. If that distribution had changed, the substrate beneath the northern margin would have changed too, slowly, invisibly, in the way that these things always change when nobody was looking at the bottom. Eelgrass grew in what it needed. When the substrate changed, the grass noticed before anything else. She was not certain of this. She was following a line of reasoning that ran from a road project 3 years ago to a tributary mouth to a sediment pattern to the substrate of a grass meadow, and she couldn't prove any of it from the surface of a skiff. But she had read her uncle's tide books enough times to know that he had noticed something similar in 1983, and that the difference between then and now was that in 1983, nothing had happened to the tributary. The grass had recovered then because nothing had changed below the surface, only the season. This time, something had changed. She found out about the Marina expansion in January at the county planning board's regular meeting, which she attended every few months the way you attended things in a small county, not because every meeting mattered, but because the ones that did tended not to announce themselves in advance. The Chesapeake Bay Marina Company, a regional development group that operated several waterfront facilities along the bay, had submitted a permit application to expand its existing facility at the south end of the lower basin. The expansion included a new deep-water boat basin, dredged to accommodate larger recreational vessels, and a floating dock complex extending across a section of the lower flat that was currently open water above an eelgrass meadow. The environmental consultant habitat survey, submitted with the application, described the lower basin meadow as partially degraded along its northern margin and healthy in its southern sections. The survey recommended approval of the dredging footprint in the northern zone, where the grass was already thinning, as the least impact option. The southern meadow would be protected. Doris read the consultant's survey 3 times. She understood the logic. She understood it well enough to see exactly where it was wrong. The southern meadow was healthy. That was true, but the southern meadows held depended on the northern margin remaining intact. The northern grass acted as a sediment filter and a buffer against tidal energy, protecting the substrate conditions that allowed the southern sections to thrive. Remove the northern margin and the southern meadow would experience increased turbidity, increased silt deposition, and increased tidal scour. Under normal conditions, a healthy meadow could absorb those pressures. Under the current conditions, with the sediment distribution already altered by the tributary rerouting, the southern meadow did not have the resilience to absorb them. It looked healthy because it hadn't been tested yet. She went home and opened a cabinet. She brought her tide books to the county planning board hearing in March. Not all of them. 14 of her uncle's and the last 10 of her own, which covered the period from the tributary rerouting to the present. She had made a hand-drawn map, eelgrass coverage from her uncle's 1970 baseline survey, her own 1995 survey, her 2010 survey, and her most recent observations. The coverage had been declining for longer than anyone knew, and the rate of decline had accelerated in the 3 years since the road project. The Marina Company's environmental consultant was a man named Bridges. He was careful and professional and had been doing habitat surveys along the Chesapeake for 20 years. He listened to Doris's presentation without interrupting. When she finished, he said that the decline she was documenting in the northern margin was consistent with his own survey findings, which was why the dredging had been sited there rather than in the healthier southern sections. He said that the southern meadow showed strong shoot density and rhizome mass consistent with a robust and resilient population. Doris asked him when his baseline survey had been conducted. He said 14 months earlier. She said, "The southern meadow has been under stress for 3 years. 14 months doesn't show you stress. It shows you what something looks like before it fails." He said the permit conditions included monitoring requirements that would track the southern meadow's response to the construction turbidity. If the meadow showed measurable decline, the permit allowed for adaptive management. The planning board approved the permit with conditions. Doris drove home along the Piankatank with the tide books on the passenger seat and the window down, listening to the water. She told herself she might be wrong about the southern meadow. This was genuinely possible. She had been reading this estuary for 37 years, but 37 years was not the same as certainty, and she had made mistakes in that time. She had predicted a blue crab season that didn't materialize. She had attributed a temporary die-off in the upper beds to salinity stress when it had actually been a disease. The estuary was not a system that rewarded overconfidence. Maybe the southern meadow was as resilient as Bridges believed. Maybe the dredging turbidity would disperse quickly enough to keep the stress below the threshold. Maybe the adaptive management conditions were sufficient. She ran her skiff over the lower flat every week and wrote in her tide book and watched the grass. Dredging began in May. The turbidity plume was visible from the dock, a brown-gray cloud that spread from the dredging footprint on the incoming tide and dispersed on the outgoing. The plume was within the permitted limits. The contractor's monitoring records showed acceptable turbidity levels at the established measurement stations. What the measurement stations didn't capture was the way the plume was settling. Doris watched it from the skiff over several weeks. The permitted stations were positioned at the meadow's outer margins. The plume was depositing most heavily along the meadow's inner edge, the zone closest to the dredging site, where the southern grass met the newly exposed substrate of the northern dredge cut. She wrote it down. Then, in August, she noticed the ospreys. The osprey poles on the lower flat had been occupied every summer since her uncle had put them up in 1979. 14 poles, positioned along the edge of the main channel, each one supporting a nesting platform. In the 37 summers since she had taken over, the poles had held between 8 and 12 active nests. She counted them every June and wrote the number in her tide book. In August of the dredging year, she counted 3. Not 3 new nests, 3 total. 5 platforms were empty. 6 showed signs of abandonment mid-season. The nests half-built and then left. She pulled her uncle's tide books and found the osprey counts going back to 1979. In 45 summers of data, the count had never dropped below 7. It had dropped below 8 only twice, both in years of documented disturbance. It had never dropped to 3. This was not the turbidity from the dredge. The dredging had finished in June. The ospreys had been failing through July. She sat with that for a long time. The ospreys fed on the fish that fed on the invertebrates that lived in and around the eelgrass meadow. If the osprey count was collapsing, the food web below it was collapsing, not because of the dredging itself. The dredging was done because of what the dredging had done to the substrate conditions in the southern meadow. The silt deposition she had been watching from the skiff was smothering the lower grass shoots, the ones closest to the dredge cut. The rhizomes, the root system that held the meadow in place and kept it growing, were being buried under accumulated fine sediment. She checked the permit monitoring records. The stations showed acceptable turbidity. They did not measure sediment deposition on the meadow floor. Those were different things, and the permit had required one and not the other. She called the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. A researcher named Dr. Kessler came out the following week. She brought dive equipment and spent 2 days in the water, pulling sediment cores from multiple points across the southern meadow's inner edge. What she found was not catastrophic in a way that catastrophes announce themselves. It was quieter than that. The sediment core showed a layer of fine-grained deposition across the inner edge averaging 2.3 centimeters in depth, accumulated since the dredging began. In normal conditions, the southern meadow's tidal flushing and the filtering function of the northern margin would have prevented this accumulation. But the northern margin was gone, and the tributary's altered sediment distribution had already reduced the tidal flushing in the inner zone. The meadow's rhizomes in the affected area were stressed. Not dead, stressed. At current accumulation rates, Dr. Kessler said, the inner third of the southern meadow would cross the threshold for significant rhizome mortality within 2 growing seasons. She said, the permit monitoring didn't catch this because it was measuring the wrong thing. The turbidity cleared. The sediment stayed. Doris showed her the tide books. The coverage maps going back to her uncle's 1958 baseline. The osprey counts. The notation about the tributary rerouting 3 years earlier. Dr. Kessler read for a long time. Then she said, "The decline started before the Marina. You've been watching this for 3 years." Doris said, "My uncle watched it before that." Dr. Kessler looked at the 1958 baseline map and then at the current coverage data and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what this is? This is the longest continuous eelgrass observation record on this part of the Chesapeake. There's nothing else like this in the county, maybe in the state." The formal review process took 8 months. The Virginia Marine Resources Commission required a remediation plan. The Marina Company's own environmental team, operating now under the authority of the permit's adaptive management conditions, designed a sediment management program for the inner Meadow zone, a series of low-profile sill structures to reduce the silt deposition, combined with replanting effort using nursery-grown eelgrass plugs sourced from a nearby donor meadow. The replanting was slow. Eelgrass did not recover at the pace that human schedules preferred. The first season showed modest establishment in approximately 30% of the planted area. The second season showed better results. The sill structures were working, and a combination of reduced deposition and active planting was beginning to show. The ospreys came back before the grass did. Not fully. 6 nests in the summer of the second recovery year, up from 3, 7 a year after. Not the 12 that her uncle had counted in his best years, but enough. Enough to mean the food web below them was rebuilding, one season at a time, at the pace that the estuary set for itself. Doris counted them every June and wrote the number in her tide book. In the autumn of the second recovery year, she received a letter from Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Dr. Kessler was right to tell her that the Institute had partnered with the Chesapeake Bay program to digitize a selection of long-term observation records from private waterfront operators across the Bay system. She was writing to ask if Doris would consider contributing her tide books, her uncle's and her own, to the program's historical baseline archive. She wrote, "Your records represent an observation window that no monitoring program could have created intentionally. 50 years of continuous data on a single estuary system, recorded by the same family, with the same methodology. We don't have anything else like it." Doris read the letter at the kitchen table with the tide book stacked beside her, her uncle's volumes on the left, her own on the right. She thought about her niece, who had been spending her summers at the dock for the past 3 years, and had started asking questions about the crabs and the grass, and why the ospreys came back to the same poles every year. She thought about what her uncle had handed her on a morning in the spring of her 32nd year. The dock lease, the key to the skiff, and 14 volumes of tide books with the instruction to read them before she did anything else. She wrote back to Dr. Kessler. She said yes, the Institute could have the record for digitization. She asked for one condition, that her uncle's name appear first in any citation, and that the record date from 1958, which was when it begun, not from 1987, when she had taken over. She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and set it on the counter to mail in the morning. Then she went down to the dock and stood at the edge in the early evening light, watching the lower flat at the turn of the tide. The water was moving the way it moved in October, a particular quality of stillness at the slack, before the current chose its direction and committed. She could see the grass from here on a calm day, the texture of it just visible in the shallower sections of the lower basin, darker and more regular than the bare sand bottom beyond it. It was there, thinner than it had been in her uncle's years, growing thinner still in the damaged sections, but present. The rhizomes were holding in the outer southern meadow, and the replanting was taking hold in the inner zone, and somewhere beneath the surface of the estuary, in the quiet negotiation between water and sediment and living root, the grass was doing what it had always done. It was reading the conditions and deciding whether to stay. Her uncle had been right. The estuary spoke in grass. You just had to be watching long enough to hear what it was saying and patient enough to write it down, and honest enough to know that writing it down was the only thing you could offer that the estuary couldn't provide for itself. She went back inside. She opened her tide book. She wrote down what she had seen.